Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and this is my July 2025 reading wrap-up. If you're not already aware, I do weekly entertainment wrap-ups of everything I read, watch, and listen to, but today we're just talking about the books. First, I'm going to get into my hardcore stats and charts, and then I'll get into what I read. Also, I put chapter markers in all of my videos, so if you need to skip over anything or go back to anything, all of that is down below. While you're checking that out in the description box, make sure that you're subscribed, because sometimes YouTube likes to unsubscribe people just for funsies. And maybe click that bell icon so you're actually notified when I upload. Also, it's summer in the Northern Hemisphere, so you get treated to seeing my shoulders, and also some of the windows have to be open, otherwise I will die, so you will hear traffic every once in a while. As a reminder, I will also be updating my bingo board from hell at the end of this video, as well as what I read for Read Queer all year. In July, I read 21 books for a total of 5,580 pages. That takes into account converting audiobook minutes to pages, so about 2,054 of those pages were actually about 79 hours of audio. The age breakdown for these books was 15 adult books, 4 YA books, and 2 middle grade books. I read 13 novels, 5 anthologies, 2 graphic novels, and 1 novelette. This month, the biggest chunk of what I read was nonfiction and contemporary, followed by horror, fantasy, historical fiction, science fiction, and speculative fiction. If you adjust by page count, not too much changes. Most of these were from the library, but I read a couple that I already owned, and one I bought from the author. I read 10 audiobooks, 8 paperbacks, 4 hardcovers, and 1 translated source online. The biggest chunk of my books were in the 200 to 299 page range, and the majority were published this decade, although I had more older titles than usual. When it comes to the genders of the authors, there was a decent mix, which meant there was a great mix when it came to the genders of the protagonists. In terms of setting, the majority were set in the United States, but I also had books set in Canada, the UK, Japan, Nigeria, Qatar, and Mexico. In terms of diversity of subject matter, the biggest chunk were queer and intersectional, and then I also had reads that fell into the categories of race, mental health, and translated. In terms of star ratings this month, I had 2 3-star reads, 3 3.5-star reads, 6 4-star reads, 5 4.5-star reads, and 5 5-star reads. Let's start with our lowest rated read and work our way up to the highest, shall we? My first 3-star read is the one that I read as an online translated source I mentioned earlier, and that's Aura by Carlos Fuentes. This is also the one that classified as being a novelette because it's longer than a short story, but it's shorter than a novella. I live in a residential area. Tell me why so many big trucks go by. So this one I specifically picked up for a particular quest on Pagebound, and I picked it up because it's really short. My library had a copy. My library also said it was coming from the world languages section and had the synopsis in English, so I figured there was a 50-50 chance it was going to come to me in Spanish, and that's exactly what happened. So I found a translation online, which was great, except for it only had 4 out of 5 of the chapters translated. So when I got to the end and it's like, okay, pay me for the last chapter, I was like, no. So I used Google Translate on my phone and read the last chapter that way. This is a really weird little story about this guy who's a historian, and he's reading the paper one day in a cafe, and it's like, hey, I'm looking for a historian, and it lists off all these things they want from a historian. He's like, all of these things are basically me. Interesting. This also pays really, really well. So the next day he goes to this house, and he goes to this really creepy courtyard, and there's no lights inside the house, and he finds this old lady in there, and she's like, my husband died many years ago, but all of his papers are in that trunk. Can you write his memoirs? And he's like, sure, it pays really well, why not? And then she has this woman taking care of her who she says is her niece, but this woman never actually talks to him. And all of a sudden he decides that he's in love with her again, even though they've never talked to each other. And then all of a sudden they start having some nighttime adventures together, and it's weird. This actually counts as a banned book as well, because somebody in the Mexican government realized that their teenage daughter was reading this for class and went, what? There's sex in this, how dare you? Even though the sex isn't, explicit, it's just like, oh, yep, they did some sex. Oh no. Other than that, all I can really say is this really escalated quickly, and I don't know if it was my favorite, but it was a fun experience nonetheless. Another horror book I read for a Pagebound quest is Where the Dead Brides Gather. This one is about this girl who is about 11 years old. She lives in a village with her family, and the night before one of her cousins is meant to get married, some things go terribly awry. Suddenly she transforms into what's known as a bride sentinel, and is basically trying to make sure that the ghosts of other brides don't try to get into the body of her cousin and take over her life. From there, she ends up going to this other world to kind of train to be this type of bride sentinel, and she meets all these brides and in kind of an afterlife situation. It's kind of like a limbo situation where they died and they were brides at the time, but they hadn't quite gotten married yet, so I guess they were fiancés at the time. And it felt really weird that this would be the structure, but also like I don't know what the afterlife is like, if it even exists, so I just went with it. All I can really say is Beta, our main character, definitely did not ask for any of this. This also seemed to meander quite a lot. It would get to a point and be like, okay, this is what the story is going to be about, and then it would change. And then you'd be like, okay, well, I guess now this is what the story is going to be about, and then it would change. So again, wasn't my favorite. Wasn't bad though. On to my 3.5 star reads, we have The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is one of those books that I've been meaning to read for ages, so I finally got around to it. This is about a few different characters, and it's one of those books that's very character driven. It's not very plot driven, so even though some things happen in this book, I honestly can't really remember them all too well. I can remember little snippets here and there, but it's really about the internal monologues of these different characters and these different familial dynamics between them, and it is very, very interesting. I'm not doing it any justice. You should just read it for yourself. Doggo. Next we have The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a group of 4 friends. One day decide that they are going to go hunt on land that they're not allowed to be hunting on. And on that land they just so happen to find a large amount of deer, like so many. Is it elk? I never know the difference between elk and deer, honestly. I'm like, is elk just the one step between deer and moose? Like, I don't actually know. In any case, something goes on that hunting expedition that really should not have gone on. And then the first major section of this book is 10 years later, following one of these particular characters and something that is going on, and him kind of remembering some promises he made about 10 years ago. And I don't really want to tell you too much more than that, because it was really fun to see this unfold and figure out why exactly it's happening now. I will tell you that this was bloody and gory and very interesting. You got to know some characters very, very well. And then also weirdly, there was a lot of talk about basketball in this one. I'm not complaining, I'm just saying it was there so much that I feel like I have to mention it, even though it doesn't really play into the plot too much. My next book on the list is the second in a series, and that's The Sea of Monsters, which is the second in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. When this one started out, it felt very formulaic. It started out basically the exact same premise as the first book, in that Percy only has one friend and everybody else treats him kind of bad, even down to the resident bully calling him the R-slur and him being like, he's not the R-slur. And then he finds out that this one friend that he has is magical and they have to go on an adventure together. That's pretty much how the first book started, and that's how this book started too. However, obviously there are major differences. It's not the same character, all of those types of things. This did have some character growth as well, and it's fun to see these different people from mythology that you've probably heard of before. I'm told by both my best friend and one of my booktube friends that I'm really going to like a character from the third book, so I'm excited to eventually get to that. However, there's about a 21-week for the audiobook from my library, so it's going to be a little while, because when I start a series as an audiobook, I like to continue it as an audiobook, and I'm willing to do that because I've got so many other things to read that I'm not even really going to notice how long it takes. On to my 4-star reads, the first one being Honey Girl, and this is the definition of a messy queer book. We have this girl who wakes up in Vegas and realizes that she married somebody last night. Somebody she met last night. She doesn't even remember her name, so all of that is a little bit awkward. She also doesn't really want to tell the people in her life, especially not her father, who will be very disappointed in her because she has a plan. They've had a plan for her for quite some time, and she's almost to the end of that plan. She needed to go to school, get her master's, get all of this education, and then get a big-time job, and she's just stumbling on that last part of the plan. So she knows that a Vegas wedding would just not be in the cards when it comes to what her father's opinion of her is. Then we also have her wife, and trying to figure out who that is firstly, and then trying to figure out what this even means. Should they even actually try to make it work? They don't even live on the same coasts as each other. Like I said, very messy, but I did enjoy it. Next we have Shut up. No, don't be worse. Shut up. Next we have Cafe Con Lychee. This is about 2 teenagers who go to the same school and whose parents own different restaurants in the same town. They've always kind of had wars back and forth because they were basically the 2 ethnic restaurants in the town, and then all of a sudden this world fusion place has opened up and it's taking a lot of their business because all of their stuff is like very visually appealing and Instagrammable, but like the food isn't actually that good. One of these teens really wants to help his parents save their shop because it's actually owned by their uncle, and he's really mean and keeps being like, oh, if you don't make make enough money, I'm just gonna turn this place into a spa and you'll have nowhere to live because you live upstairs and you'll get kicked out. And then the other teen's family is like, actually, we think we're just gonna sell the shop. And he's like, what do you mean you're gonna sell the shop? Like, I thought I was gonna work in the shop one day and now here we are and you're just taking it from me, and that's not great. Both of these teens are queer, but only one of them is out, and because of what's going on in their lives, they end up having to team up to try to save both businesses. This was delightful and full of very foodie things, but also it's dual POVs, so we get to be in both of these characters' heads and figure out exactly what's going on, and have one of them realize, actually, I don't really hate this guy, I think I kind of like him, and why is that? Why have I thought I hated him all this time? And it's just good. Next we have You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight. This is about a character who works at a horror experience that is set at this camp that they used for a movie back in the 1980s. Basically, it's this simulation experience where the customers will come in, they're told, meet up at the lodge at 8 o'clock, and then while they're at the lodge and they're just mingling with other people, suddenly somebody comes in bloody and bleeding, is like, oh my god, there's a madman on the loose. And then our main character actually plays the final girl, and she also is basically in charge, so she decides how that night is going to go down. If there's a particularly rude customer, that customer is definitely getting killed. Because the employees don't actually hurt people. In fact, if they feel like that employee is going to be a problem, they will kick them off the job so quick. It's nearing the end of the season, but some weird things start happening, and then she needs to bring in some backup because some people no-showed for their jobs, and it goes from there. I actually read this basically all in one sitting. It was technically 2 sittings, but on the same day, and I highly recommend that experience of this book. Next we have All Our Ordinary Stories. This is a multi-generational memoir about this woman who's living in Calgary. I think she was actually born in Calgary, but both of her parents are from China originally, and they immigrated. They in fact were freedom swimmers, which is something I had never heard of previously. This book not only talks about our main character and her struggles with talking to her family, because she knows some Mandarin, they know some English, and she's always had to be the translator for them in Canada because she was the eldest daughter, and that's just how that goes. From there, we're also getting some stories from her parents and then also distant relatives, and it's just delightful. I learned a lot from this, but also a lot of it felt very, very familiar, because even just looking at the panels and being like, oh yeah, we grew up on television, and I could tell by looking at the television what program she was watching. If you're a fan of graphic memoirs, this is definitely one to look out for. Next we have Izzy at the End of the World. This is about a girl named Izzy. You might have been able to guess that from the title alone. She lives with her sister and her grandparents because they don't know their fathers, and also her mother died about a year ago. One night she's going outside just to stargaze, and all of a sudden there's all these lights in the sky, and then all of a sudden her family is just gone and she doesn't know what to do. The only family member left in the house with her is Aka, her faithful dog, who I absolutely adore, and the two of them end up going on an adventure to try to figure out what's going on and what are these creatures that have just arrived on Earth. Our main character Izzy is autistic and bisexual, so there's a lot of great representation there, and eventually she does meet somebody else on Earth, and that whole situation also comes with some representation. There are definitely some trigger warnings to do with this book, so if you need trigger warnings, I would definitely look them up ahead of time, because although this is kind of a fun romp because it's a middle grade book, it can't get too scary, it does get very serious at some points. Next we have another memoir, and that's Beyond the Throne. This is the memoir of the guy who played Hodor on Game of Thrones. He's also in Our Flag Means Death. This was just a delightful time, honestly. Like, I didn't know much about this guy going into this. I didn't even know he was queer, or that he used to do drag, or all of the different various things that he's done in his life, and it was just great. I love reading people's memoirs, especially when I'm like, oh yeah, I remember them from insert thing here. What has their life actually been like? And he has some very interesting stories. I also really liked how this was structured, because we go back and forth between talking a little bit about the behind the scenes of Game of Thrones, but then other things in his life, and it would go back and forth. So it wasn't just that Game of Thrones took up like a giant chapter in the middle of this, it was just kind of back and forth talking about these different things as time went on, and I really liked that structure. Another memoir I read this month is Wine Witch on Fire. This is all about this woman who works in the wine industry as a reviewer of wines, and a particularly stressful year back in 2012. Because at the beginning of the year, her husband of 20 years decided he didn't want to be married to her anymore, and at the end of that year, she was accused of plagiarism, which when you make all of your money from writing is not something you want to be accused of. We kind of know what happens in December at the very beginning of the book, and then we kind of go back back to the beginning of the year and work through all of the seasons, and then past the end of December to figure out how that situation played out. This was written really, really well. I was really intrigued to figure out what was going on in this woman's life, and the witch imagery is used all throughout the book, which I really appreciated. Next we have Boys Run the Riot Volume 3, which is the second to last book in this 4-volume series. I actually have the 4th one out from the library right now, but I just haven't quite gotten to it yet. This is about a trans boy and a cis boy who decide that they want to create a fashion brand together, and by the end of the first volume they also have another person come on as their photographer. The second volume ended in such a way where I was like, oh no, this situation is gonna be bad, so I was very interested to get into this volume, and I won't tell you what happens, but I will tell you I continue to really enjoy this story, and I'm excited to see how it wraps up in the next volume. Next we have The Midnight Library, which is a book that I've been holding off on reading, not for a particular reason, just because like I knew I'd eventually get around to it because it sounds like a very bookish book, and in fact it was a pretty bookish book. I didn't even really know the premise of this book going into it, I just knew it had something to do with a library at midnight, and yes it does, but the way the main character got to this library is by trying to take her own life after a very, very bad day. She got to the Midnight Library, which is kind of a limbo situation where she's able to look back at all her regrets and see her life and how it would have played out if she made some different decisions. Which means she's opening these different books and going back and being like, well, what would happen if I actually became a swimmer instead of quitting swimming when I was a kid, and what that life would have looked like. This was really wonderful as a thought experiment, and I really enjoyed it. I could also see this being a really fun book to adapt if they did it really well, because you'd have so many different styles and costuming and all of those types of things to play with. The next book is Sea of Tranquility. This is a book told in 4 different parts and follows 4 different people in 4 completely different time frames. And very much like the last book, this has a time travel element to it. I was delighted, although not super surprised, that the first perspective back in 1912 actually is this guy who ends up on Vancouver Island, which is where I live and which is where this author lives. I was also very delighted that I think it's the third perspective is an author herself who has a book come out that's primarily about pandemics, so she gets to talk about what it's like being a person who's written a book about pandemics that gets very popular during a pandemic, which, oh yeah, that definitely happened because the sales for Station 11 definitely skyrocketed in 2020. This author's writing is just absolutely beautiful, and I loved seeing how these different perspectives connected to each other, and it was just so good. I don't know why I haven't read more by this author besides the 2 titles I've already mentioned. Next we have the book that I actually bought directly from the author, and that's Care Of by Ivan E. Coyote. Ivan was actually one of the speakers at Pride in the Word, which is a literary event put on by the Victoria Pride Society every year, and it was just a delightful experience to sit there and hear these stories. I was front row, and it was just such a great experience. I've heard of Ivan before, I've never actually seen any of their work before, so I was excited to finally get around to doing this because I know they travel a lot and I know they come to the island pretty often, which was something that was definitely reflected in this book. This was a book of letters that they wrote primarily during the 2020 times because they love receiving and replying to letters, but there are some that they've just kind of kept for when they have more time to do a better response to, and those are the letters that are included in here, and a lot of them are from people on Vancouver Island, which was just really great. For me personally, obviously, because I'd be like, oh yeah, I've been there. And it got to the point where I was like, am I going to turn the page and find a letter from somebody I know? Because it really felt like that was going to happen. Don't you just love it when your alarm goes off, but your phone is like across the room and you gotta turn off your camera to go deal with it? Yeah, that's what just happened. Oh yeah, I guess I'm sitting over here because I'm still putting books here. Okay. On to my 5-star reads. The first one is a reread that I reread every year, and that's Me and White Supremacy. This is a book that you might guess is about you and your place in white supremacy. This book originally started as a 28-day Instagram challenge and then was formatted into this book, so you can read it at your own pace. There are also journaling prompts at the end of every chapter, so you can think about how this system affects you and how you have affected this system. Like I said, I reread this every year. I believe this was my 7th reading of it, and I made a promise to reread it every year just so I have these ideas kind of at the forefront of my brain, so I do not hinder the system more than I already have at some points in my life. My next 5-star read is The Perks of Being a Wallflower. This is a book that I knew nothing about going into it, and I found absolutely delightful. This one is about a boy named Charlie who is writing these letters to somebody, and we don't really know who this somebody is. We just know that he's being kind of anonymous in these letters to this person, but it just makes him feel good to be able to write about his experiences to somebody. And it's all about him just growing up and learning things about himself, and then eventually remembering things about himself. And there's lots of high school shenanigans, but then there's also a lot of really deep, dark stuff that comes up, and it's just absolutely brilliant. And I cannot elaborate any further than that because I cannot do it justice. I can say I highly recommend the audiobook version of this though, because it was just so intriguing to have Charlie be talking to me while I went for a very long walk one day. The final memoir on this list is Cactus Country, a boyhood memoir, and this is all about this gender fluid person who grew up and kind of had a boyhood because they were identifying as a boy during that time frame in their life, and then this book actually extends into their early 20s and how things kind of changed for them. It's all about growing up in a mobile home park and what it was like to have all of your friends kind of show up and then move away pretty often. And then going to school was always a little bit different because Zoe would never really tell people what gender they were. They would just kind of let people assume, but then sometimes the teachers would rat them out basically because they were definitely presenting as a boy at that time, and it really pleased them to have people assume they were a boy. But although their parents weren't malicious about it, they didn't really get it. This memoir is written incredibly beautifully, and I understand why because we go on to find out that Zoe actually studied writing, so I would love to read more of her work in the future. The penultimate book on this list is The In-Between Bookstore. This is all about a trans man named Darby. He lives in New York City and he just lost his job at this startup, which really is not a great time to be losing his job because the rent on his shoebox apartment has just gone up, and he decides, maybe I'll just go home to my small town and hang out with my mom for a while. He finds out that she's actually about to move into a condo and she needs help moving and kind of organizing the things from the family house before the move. So he's like, perfect, this is a great time to go back, although I haven't really spent that much time there, especially since I transitioned, so that'll be kind of different, but whatever. One of the things that prompts him to go back is he finds this box from the In-Between Bookstore under his bed, which is the bookstore that he used to work at in this small town. So he wonders to himself if that place is still there, and when he shows up in town and goes into the store, he's greeted with the 17-year-old version of him working behind the counter. This is obviously a very strange situation, but he tries to use it to his advantage to figure out why he and his best friend from high school had a falling out, because he really doesn't understand why they stopped talking to each other. He's also confronted with that best friend, Michael, in the present, and he's still trying to figure it out, but Michael won't talk about it. This was an absolutely beautiful thought experiment and such a compelling story. I really loved all of the side characters and just getting to know them and their little quirks, and there were multiple times where I would just laugh out loud about something his mom was complaining about. My favorite book this month was Let Them Stare by Jonathan Van Ness and Julie Murphy. I knew nothing going into this book besides who the two authors were, and I've loved both of their writing before, so I was just like, let's read this. It turns out that this book is about a non-binary cutie named Sully who is just about to go to New York City, leave their small town behind, work as an assistant to an influencer, and just live their best life. However, you can probably guess some things don't go as smoothly as they would have wanted, and there's some messy things to do with their departure from town. Additionally, they have an eye for fashion, and one day they find this vintage bag at the thrift store they used to work at, and they are convinced that this is an authentic Butler bag, which is this very highly praised item, but when they open it, they get more than they bargained for. This is all about friendships and first loves and messy situations and people not necessarily understanding you and fighting for yourself, and also learning about queer history and how queer history isn't just in big places, it's in these smaller towns as well. This was absolutely delightful, and I also had no idea that JVN would be the narrator when I started the audiobook, and then I was just very happy about that experience. This was wonderful. I loved all of these characters. I would gladly read more books by these authors together. This was so good. Alright, the Read Queer All Year prompts for July were like this. For non-binary rep, I read Care Of, but you could also put Let Them Stare in that space. For drag, I read Beyond the Throne. For gender fluid, I read Cactus Country. And for previous rec, I read Honey Girl because I meant to read this a few years ago and just never got around to it. When it comes down to the bookish bingo board from hell, I've had a little bit of progress. In fact, I was able to mark off the very first square on the bingo board because I have now read 10 banned books. I'm now up to 3 readathons because I did one this month. That was Weekend at Timmy's. I read 3 more books from my 40 before 40 TBR, so that's coming along, although I still have a long way to go. I'm up to 4 rereads with Me and White Supremacy, and I'm up to 6 translated books with the additions of Boys from the Riot Volume 3 and Aura. If you want to hear me talk more about these books or other books for that matter, the playlist for my weekly entertainment wrap-ups is always linked down below. If you've read any of these or you now want to read any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or smiley face if you happen to be on your keyboard. Some people have asked if there's a way to financially support this channel, so I set up a Ko-fi account, which is a digital tipping service. The link for that, as always, is down below. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!